Hello. Yeah. Okay.
Perfect.
Am I audible?
Yes.
Great. Okie dokie. Okay, so welcome to the Flask talk. Glad that you guys decided to come in today. It's going to be a really productive hour, I hope. So just to get a feel for, well, first I want to say it's great that. Yeah, this is not sounding good.
Sorry. Okay, talk now.
Okay. Check. Okay. So over the last hour, you heard from Dale about how to use Python, right? So you learned some basics of how to code with Python and kind of just getting your feet wet with a text editor and running programs and things like that, right? And you might be wondering now, okay, so I know a little bit about Python, but what can I actually use it for, right? And you also might be wondering how to actually build websites, right? Probably that's a common thing you might want to do is like develop a website, right? So what we're going to do now is we're going to talk about how to actually build a website and what websites are, essentially, with the architecture, and then we're going to actually go in and we're going to create a very simple application with that. Now, with that being said, I don't want you guys to code along because, well, first of all, I actually have some boilerplate code that you guys don't have that I'm going to rely on. So therefore, you actually literally it won't work for you. And then the second part is my goal for you guys for this hour is to understand kind of conceptually how a website works, what all the things are that go into it. And then you guys I'll give you my code, you can look at it and play around with it later, but for me, really understanding kind of a high level overview of kind of what things are talking to each other and how it works is the main purpose of the talk today, essentially. Okay, so I want to begin by discussing kind of how a website works. So who here, so I know this is just, very introductory. Has anyone here like made a website before, like played with HTML, CSS, stuff like that? Few people, but not a few people, okay. And who here had used Python before today? Several people as well. Okay, well that's great. That will help you today, but you certainly don't have to have that experience to be able to follow along. The first thing that I want to talk about is when we build a website, kind of what's going on, right? And it's important to understand this because otherwise you'll be looking at the code and you don't understand how it fits in kind of the greater picture of what's going on. And you'll be very confused. So this is a diagram of front end and back end. Okay, so when we look at a website, a typical website that most people develop, it looks something like this. So what you can see is on the left side, we have the database, right? So this is where the data is being stored. You just hear people talk about big data or, we have it in a database somewhere, right? And that's where the data is stored, essentially. And you hear people talk about the server, right? Like, oh, the server's down, or we need to restart the server, the server is making requests, stuff like that. And you also hear about people like Nick, who's gonna talk to you later about doing HTML, CSS, front-end stuff, right? So you might hear people say the word front-end and the word back-end, right? So you hear these two terms a lot, and understanding what they do is very important, right? So when we talk about front-end, what's happening is this is what the user is actually seeing, right? On the right, if you look at front-end web development, this is just what the user is interacting with, and they're going to click buttons, they're going to fill out forms, and they're going to actually interact with the web page, right? But the thing is, there's more to it than just that, right? Because once the user enters data and receives data, right, we have to have some sort of control, right? We have to have some sort of management of information to store the data, right? There's kind of a middleman. And that middleman sits on a server, right? Okay, so that's kind of how this works. And so we can imagine, let's say we have an app like Uber, right? So our app like Uber, like on our phone, is actually also front end, just like that laptop is. But what it's doing is it's sending information, say like my coordinates right now and what my username is, to a database that's logging that information, or to a server that's logging that information. And then that is controlling some sort of logic, like how much the user should pay, right? How far they've gone, whether users are involved, and then it's going to send that to the database, which is going to store that information, right? That's kind of how that works. And an important thing is to look at, so in this diagram, you see there's one computer and one backend, right? But in real life, there's typically many of these computers and just one server, right? So all of the computers, so if you all opened up a web page and sent information to my server, you would all be sending information to one server, right? So it's a many-to-one relationship. It's not one-to-one. There's not just one server running for each client. So that's kind of something that's important to understand, right? So does anyone have any questions about sort of this overall front and back end development? Anything that's unclear? Okay, so today we're mostly going to be actually talking about backend development because Flask, this framework that we're talking about today, is a backend framework. So you see PHP, so when people talk about PHP, typically they're doing backend. You might hear them talk about Node, or you might hear them say Ruby on Rails. Or for Python, you might hear something like Django, or what we're going to talk about today is Flask. Okay, so these are just all names for different programs and ways of organizing code that just do this backend stuff. So it's handling data, right? It's not handling what the user sees. Although we'll talk about how actually it can be used for that more or less. Okay, so this is one kind of overarching idea in web development that's important to understand. But there's also one other one that we need to talk about too that's kind of tangential to this. But you also need to understand this in order to really understand what web development is. And this is the notion of a model view controller architecture, which predominates most web development that you see today. So this, instead of talking about, so what we talked about before was actually where the code is running. And this is more of a logical breakdown of what's going on, what the code is actually doing. So the view, we'll start with the view. When you go to a computer and you open up the screen, you see a view. And that's the website, the front end that we just discussed. And that's what you interact with. You click, you move around, you enter data, right? And then once you enter the data, you're going to press enter, right? And what happens after you press enter, right? That data is sent to what's called a controller, which is typically, it can be front end or back end, just kind of depends how you want to break it down. But it's a controller that's going to handle that data, make changes to the data, make manipulations, and then it's going to store that in a model, the database. Model is the database, right? And the model is just whatever data you want to store, right? Say, again, we're going back to Uber. We have a username. We have the ride, like the ride number that they have right now, maybe some other information about how long they've traveled or how much they owe or their credit card information. So each of those is just going to be a field, a record in a database, right? The different types of information is going to be a field, and then each time I enter a ride, that's going to be a new record in the database, okay? So, and then there's just kind of interactions and arrows between these things that is kind of how a website actually works. So you actually have code to essentially control all of these things. And today what we're going to mostly talk about, what I'm going to dive into soon, is going to be the controller aspect of this, what actually handles the data. And we'll talk a little bit about views too, but really Nick is going to tell you more later when he talks about HTML and CSS, how views actually typically work, okay? So does anyone have a question about these concepts before I begin kind of going a little bit more into depth? Okay. So what I mentioned, so Flask, you guys might have read the description, and Flask is essentially what we call, it's called a micro framework, but really, okay, it's like mostly just a framework, which I just mentioned earlier. It's a way, it's someone who's built kind of some code for us to make our lives easier as we use Python to do this sort of data management on a website, right? And it's a micro framework because it just means it's very flexible. It's kind of, you don't have to do a lot to get it working. It's very simple, right? A perfect thing for a beginner to kind of get their feet wet with this sort of thing, right? So that's nice. So we're going to use that. And what we're going to do, Flask actually just creates what's called just a server, right? We're going to create a server, which is, like I mentioned, a backend. So if you can imagine, again, in this view here, it's the center thing, right? We're making a server right here. Okay. So let me move this. Okay, so here's a command line. I know this might be basic, or maybe it's actually confusing. I know command lines can be confusing at first, but it's just another way of interacting with my computer, right? And when we first open up, we're going to look at a Flask app, just a very simple Flask app that we're going to build today. And what we can see, there's this thing called app.py, right? So this is the main file that actually controls essentially all of the things that we do with Flask, right? So what you can see first is we're going to do some imports. So we're just basically importing different things. And the framework is called Flask, right? And Flask is just a module, so basically some code that people have built that we're just going to use, right? So all we're doing here is we're just pulling in other code that other people have made, okay? And all we have to do actually to make a Flask app is just type, app equals Flask name underscore, okay? So here we're making an app. And we have to do a little bit other. So with Python, you have, if it's a main script, you actually want to call it. So this is like maybe a little bit confusing, but just don't pay too much attention to it. And we have to basically say with the server we have a port, so we need to essentially say, we have to bind it to a port. And we have to say the port number. And then we're just going to run our app. So app.run. And we're going to specify our host. And this is just boilerplate code, right? This is stuff that's set up for us. You can just copy and paste this almost all the time. I'm just typing it out to like show you. And we also need to say our port, which we just defined right here. Okay, so this is all we actually need, like the boilerplate code, just to get a Flask app running. Okay, so I'm going to show you how to run this essentially. And we'll see how live coding works. If we get any errors, perhaps we will. Yeah, Nick knows how that is. Okay. So here we're at our command line, right? And all we're going to do is just execute this Python script, right? So Python app.py. App.py is the name of our file right here. We're just going to run that. And it's going to start up a server. Okay. So now we have a server running. And this server doesn't do much right now. In fact, it doesn't do really. Okay, so yeah, there we go. That's our good old. Yeah, that's an issue, live coding in front of people. Okay. So definitely point those out if you find more issues. Anyway, so that's going to essentially run a server. And now what we want to do, there we go, that's perfect. And now really nothing's going to happen. We don't have any sort of information set up. But what we're doing now is, okay, yeah, so it's not going to find anything. So actually, I'm not even going to show you that yet. But what a server does, right, is it listens. So I have a server, which is just a program, and it's going to run. It's just going to run, and it's going to wait for someone to go to this server and ask for information or to give it information, right? So what we do is we're just making a request to the server for information, right? And what we're going to do is we're going to make, essentially, we're going to have it listen at a certain spot. So we're going to call it a route, right? And what we're going to do with this is just whenever someone goes to the website, just the main port, we're just going to have it respond very simply, right? And what we're going to do is we're going to make a little function. Function is just something that takes something in and returns something out. And we're going to have it return just a little bit of text. So we're just going to have it return a little bit of HTML. And we're just going to say hello. To make our little function here. And just gonna give this a glance to see if anything is messed up. Looks to be good. Okay, so now we're gonna restart our Python program, right? Because we made some changes. So we're gonna restart our Python program. Thank you. Extra colon? We don't. Thank you. So now we're going to run our Python server, right? And we're going to sit here and now, so our Python server is just going to listen for someone to go to our main port, right? So we're going to click on this and we're going to go to it. And our server is going to run the program and we're going to see, hello. So what's interesting to see is this server is listening, right? And it's going to tell us when it found something. So right here, what we see is this is the server registering that someone just visited the website, okay? So we'll reset it again. We'll visit it again. Let's see what's going on. Okay, we got another one. So we have this thing, so we're communicating using this protocol called HTTP, right? Which is like the main internet protocol, and we're going to communicate over that in order to essentially get information, right? And we did this thing called a GET request, which essentially is just requesting information, okay? And there's other types of requests that you can make over HTTP. You can do a POST request, which is I'm giving you information, and you're going to store it in the database, for instance. And you can do a whole host of other things, patch, put, et cetera, if you want to update, modify, things like that. But today we're just going to do GET requests. We're just going to request information, okay? So now you guys might say, oh, this is cool. We have this server. So this is just running on my machine. My machine is literally just running this Python program, which Flask allows us to have a server. And we might want to have some, sort of more information or some more sort of interesting things, right? So one thing we can do is we can actually create a new route. So we can have app.route. So this just essentially matches whatever we're going to on our main page. And we can have this thing. So why don't we have like a users page, right? And why don't we actually allow people to enter a different username in the route? So we'll call this user. And we get to make a new function. And if you don't worry about taking any photos, or if you can, if you want to, of course, but I can also make all this code available to you guys if you want to dig into it and play around with it some more, and also give you some more resources. Okay, so what we're going to do here, so this is we're creating a new route. So what this maps to, so you can see here, this is a route that I'm highlighting right here. This just maps to in the browser when someone goes to it. So we're just going to have, they're going to go /users / the username. And little foreshadowing, we're gonna give Jim his own little page, okay? So that's what we're gonna do next. And this actually gets into a view, right? So this is actually what the user's seeing. So we can kind of also talk about how this is a view a little bit. But what we wanna do first is we wanna actually render some HTML, okay? So the way that we're going to do that is we're going to return what's called a template that we made called user.html, and we're just going to make the name equal to user. So all we're doing here is so we have a template called user.html, and the name that we're passing to this template, this HTML, is called user, which we just pass in from our route right here, okay? So this brings into the whole idea of a template, which is just a view, right? A view like HTML, a website that you interact with, with a little bit more kind of rich information in that, okay? So what we have to do with Flask, the way that we do it, that is we're going to make a new file. So let's stop our server, a new folder actually called templates. And within this folder, we are going to make whatever kind of file we want, right? So we just made this thing called user.html, right? And we're just going to make a new one of these right here. So we're just going to open this up in our text editor. And if this command line stuff looks crazy, that's okay. Don't worry. You don't have to do it. I just do it because it's a bit faster. And here we're going to basically have all of our logic for our users page, okay? So here we're just going to make some simple HTML that Nick's going to tell you more about later. And let's make it a really simple page. Okay, so just don't worry about that. That's just some magic. Doesn't matter. Okay, so within the main part of our HTML, what we're going to do is we're actually going to display the name of the user who visited the website, right, that we put in that page. So we're just going to make a little, let's call it a tag H5 tag. And we're going to say, before we do that, let's remove this bad boy. Alrighty. Hello. And the way that Flask handles users, so we're actually passing a variable to this HTML page, right? So we're going to say name, which is what we pass in. Welcome to TigerTalks. Not properly punctuated. That's okay. Okay. So this is our template now that we've just saved within the template folder. Okay. So now, what we're going to do now, so what are the steps that's going to happen? So we're going to go in our browser to this, to user/gem, right? And our server is going to be listening, right? And whenever someone enters users / some name, it can be any name, it's a variable, right? Then we're going to pass it to this function, which takes an input and generates an output. And this function is going to essentially call our HTML with this variable provided, right? And our HTML also looks at this variable name right here, okay? Does anyone have a question kind of like how this stuff works and like what's going on? Or is completely lost? Because that's totally okay. It's hard to judge. I just want to make sure that like you guys are, no one's like completely lost. It's like hard to kind of get the pace right for where everyone's at. So if you, certainly like if you're confused, please tell me and I would be happy to explain more, okay? Yeah.
How's it knowing where the name from? How does it know where that variable?
Yeah, so this is really the magic of Flask. So whenever we do a framework, right, this provides all these conventions, right? So it says this is how it is, and if you do it, there's essentially a bunch of other Python structures that know how to interpret this information, right? So you can look, there's a bunch of Python code somewhere in this module called Flask that handles this sort of stuff, but we don't have to care, right? That's the nice thing. We don't have to know where it comes from or how it works. We just do what it says, and it works. So that's the whole idea of a framework, right? We don't have to do these things from scratch. We just use other people's code. Okay, so now barring any sort of issues, we can actually run our server again, right? We can say Python app.py. And now our server is listening, so we have to actually go back out to where the file is. And it's now going to listen for someone to go to that endpoint, okay? So now we can go to gem, user/gem, and maybe it'll just tell us, hello, Jim, welcome to TigerTalks, right? And now here, Jim is a variable, right? So like it can be any person can go to this, and the website will, handle that just fine, right? So maybe Dale was here earlier, so, hello, Dale, welcome to TigerTalks.
Do Colby.
This spell it right? Yeah, Colby. So yeah, we're gonna welcome Colby to TigerTalks. And right now, I just have one server doing this. And if I had this, so this little program is running on my computer, but if I put this program running on something that's accessible to the web, which it won't go into that, but yeah, so if it was accessible to you guys could all come to my computer, you could enter your own name, and it would respond with the name that you entered, right? This is the key of how a server works, right? And the cool thing is if we looked at our server right here, so we can see each time it responded to someone who entered a different name. So you can see here we have on the first one, if you look here on the bottom, we have the first is Jim, right? The second one is Dale, and the last one is Colby right here. Okay, so that's kind of how that works. Okay, but you guys might say, this is cool, right? But we want to do some cool stuff. Okay, we want to maybe have a little bit more interesting things going on than just getting users and names and stuff like that. Okay, so why don't we do something like getting the weather? Maybe that would be more interesting. So we can define a new route, right? Actually, first, before continuing, does anyone have any sort of like questions, concerns, unclarities that they want to ask about? No, okay. So we're gonna actually now make a different endpoint that does a little bit more stuff. Actually, so because we're kind of, we have some more time. How much time do we have left? Okay, so we really have time to do one of these two things. So do you guys want to get weather based off our location, or do you want to get some tweets based off our location? Raise your hand for weather.
I will tweet some moving now.
This room is very weather oriented. Okay, raise your hand for tweets. Okay, I think weather wins. That's okay. Okay, so why don't we make an app? So we're going to make a back end, right? So with this, so what we just talked about here, it's important to talk about this real quick, is we just made a view, which is what you see here, right? And this code, the code that corresponds to the view is this. So this is a view, right? And this is a very, very simple controller, okay? And there's not really much of a model here. There's the model that you could argue is the user, but there's not much going on there. But this is all sort of on, so this is kind of mostly back end, but also it handles a little bit with the front end too. But what we're going to do now with weather is we're just going to make a back end application, okay? We're just going to do straight back end. This is just going to be back end functionality. And this can be called by a website maybe that you'd make later. And actually, we're going to make a website on Wednesday at the whiteboard to talk about essentially front end stuff instead of back end stuff that calls this endpoint. Okay, it's called an endpoint when you do this. So we'll get into that more, but I'm just going to kind of type up the code now real quick. So we're going to make a new route, and this route is going to be called, as you might guess, weather. Okay, so that's cool. So now we're going to make a new function, and we're going to call this function very creatively get weather. Okay, and it's not going to take any inputs this time. But what we care about two things, right? So we want to get the weather for our current location. So maybe a way that might make sense to do this is to just take the latitude and the longitude, right? So let's do that. So we're going to get our lat. And I'm just going to kind of type this up now, and then I'll talk to you a little bit more after I do this about kind of what's going on, okay? Because it's a lot to type and explain. Actually, it's gonna do long. Okay, cool. So, and yep, still typing. You can say it out loud if you, yeah, location info dot get current weather. Cool. Okay, so then we're gonna pass in as an argument to this function. We're calling a function, and we're gonna pass in as an argument the latitude and the longitude, LON, that we've recovered here. So I'll talk about this more later. Don't get too distraught about it yet. Very nice. Okay, cool. So now this is actually all we need to do right now. And I'll show you kind of what's going on first. So what we're going to do, so have you guys ever went to a website, and when you go to the website, like you see this like question mark, right? And then you see like name equals JSON, and sorry, age equals 7, right? You see all this like crap on the URL, right? And you might wonder like why, what are they doing here? This is crazy. Well, this is worth you coming out Saturday just to find this out, because this is called like query parameters, okay? So you're actually specifying information to the website when you do this that it uses to query certain things, and it shows up in your URL, so you can actually see what it's querying. It's something that's fun to do whenever you go to a website. Just look at that and see what it's doing, because that's the information you're providing to them. You can actually have lots of fun. You can change the information once you can, I don't know, just whatever you want to do. You hackers out there can try that. Anyways, so what we're going to do now is through the URL, we're going to pass the latitude and the longitude to the server, okay? So that's what we're going to pass to the server, okay? And once we pass the latitude and the longitude, it's what's called an argument, a request argument, okay? So we're just passing some information to the server, and Flask, very kindly of them, allows us to get this information by this key called lat. So if we say lat equals something, that will allow us to get the information associated with it. So it's very, very nice of them to do that. And then after that, we're going to go and we're going to get some current weather information, okay? And now don't get too mad because I kind of cheated, okay? This is already done. I'm sorry. But that's what this is right here, okay? So, and you can see right here, we're actually doing another query. All we're doing is, it's nothing crazy, right? It might look scary, but we're just doing a query with, we're saying the weather is equal, we have this ID that we have, and we specify units equals to imperial. So we could do metric if we feel really mischievous. And we're just gonna pass the latitude and the longitude that are passed into this function, okay? And then we get another response with some other information that we just pass back, okay? So this is just kind of standard Python stuff and parsing a web response. And I'm not gonna talk about this too much because I don't wanna cover too many things at one time. But just, yeah, so you can use Python to do this. And we get this back as a thing called response. And then we can turn it into JSON, and that's kind of a standard language. I'll show you what it looks like in a second. And we're just gonna return that to whoever sent the request, okay? And since we're making that from our browser, we're gonna see it in our browser too, okay? And so yeah, let's just, let's run this now and kind of see what happens here. So now, right, first of all, we need to reset our server because we changed the code, right? Now we pray there's not any issues that will arise. Looks to be acceptable for now. Okay, and so now what we can do is we can go to the browser, right? And we can go to weather. Oh, I kind of cheated here. Oh, you got me. So weather is what the endpoint we're going to, and we have an argument called latitude, and we have our current latitude, or technically the latitude from my house, and the longitude, which is the longitude from my house as well. And we're just gonna pass these guys into our server, okay? Anybody have a question about what's going on here? Does it look crazy or magical or anything? Okay, so that's just how we're entering the information to the program, okay? And now we're just going to press, we're gonna go to this website, right? Oh, and bam, get it back. We see the name, so we're in Colombia. The temperature is 68.32 degrees Fahrenheit. The maximum temperature for today is 69.08 degrees Fahrenheit, and the minimum is 67.82, and the wind is 5.82. Yeah, so that's our information back, and this is called JSON. And this is kind of what websites use to communicate pretty often. And it's a key value pair, okay? So The idea is everyone can guarantee we're going to have a name, and then we're going to have a string, which maybe they'll tell you about strings like the city, and then we're going to have a temperature, and then we're going to have a floating point value. And this is going to be standard. So no matter where I query with the latitude and longitude, we're always going to have the same format returning, right? And this is important because if you're a website, you can use this information, okay? And this is what I mean. So you're seeing this and you're like, okay, I would never see this on a website, right? This doesn't make sense, right? You never see this on a website. And the reason is because what I remember is I told you we're in a backend, right? This is a backend. This isn't for users to see. So later, if you make some HTML with Nick and you see something pretty on your website, you'll actually make a call to this endpoint and you're actually going to get information from you, okay? And that's going to return it to your computer, right? So that's where the backend server interfaces with the front end that Nick or someone like HTML, CSS, and you make a request, get this information, and then you display it really pretty. You guys understand kind of like the distinction between the two? So this is just a server essentially, okay? So that's kind of what happens here with when we talk about these sort of different protocols and information and kind of how you make a request through that. So I think we're just about out of time. But if anyone has like a quick question, feel free to ask. Okay, I'll also be here afterwards, so if you want to ask questions, feel free. And I can give you the code from today too, since you guys were really good, I'll also give you the tweets too if you want to query tweets. That's also a possibility. And yeah, that's pretty much it. So thanks for coming and have a good rest of your Saturday.